Really great. I mean, you mentioned 12 members, so perhaps, Jerome, for those out there who aren't aware or perhaps understand very deeply what the initiative, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, is about, perhaps you can describe those members, because it is quite an extraordinary group, really, in terms of the range, both in terms of listed and private companies and, big national oil companies that you have as members, and of course, really very global, which is, I think, a big commendable, something to be really congratulated on, because we often have initiatives that may be very focused from either they may be focused from a European perspective or a US perspective or a Chinese perspective, but this is very deliberately global as an initiative. So perhaps you could kind of outline a bit of that, where it's come from and why these members.
Yes, thanks, Nicolette. And I would say it is global, as you said, and it is at a very high level, as it is CEO-led. And we are trying to represent what our CEO wants to do and how they want to engage in the topic. As for all these companies, the matter is crucial. It is a CEO-led matter for these 12 companies. And yes, you are totally right. When you look at OGCI, 12 member companies, which represent about 30% of the global oil and gas production. So it's very big. We really represent a very significant share of the global oil and gas production. And what is even more interesting is that as part of our member companies, we have, I would say, usual suspects, the main European majors and oil and gas companies, the main US majors and oil and gas companies. And we have as well 3 of the most powerful, the largest national oil companies of the planet, which we very seldom talk about when we engage on climate with the stakeholders we all know about everywhere. And these 3 companies are CNPC, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation company, which is, I think, very important, in particular in the current environment where we have heard these commitments from China this week in New York, Aramco, and as we know, Aramco is the largest oil and gas company in the planet, representing Saudi Arabia, and Aramco is a country-owned company. And then, last but not least, Petrobras, representing Brazil, which is as well a company partially owned by the government. So it's very important to have these 3 companies representing these 3 countries. And as we know, China, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil are key to the climate challenge and the way we will solve the climate challenge in the coming 30 to 40 years. But, maybe, Nicolette, on this, your support could be and is, in fact, absolutely great, because you are a leader in your area. And as you are a leader, you have a voice. And therefore, the way you leverage your voice to embark stakeholders who are not naturally part of the discussion, it can be very powerful and very interesting for us. And for instance, and you naturally embark with listed companies and companies that are in Europe, in the US. But the more you will find positive ways to stimulate and embark national oil companies and companies coming from elsewhere, the more, in fact, it will help everybody to create a coherent journey.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, CDP, as you say, traditionally, we come from the world of listed companies. It's our first sort of mandate to drive transparency and disclosure in the system has come from the institutional investors, which obviously then lends yourself naturally to a listed company world. And that then broadly in the initial stages meant we had a very much a sort of deep penetration. We've got over 75% of the S&P 500. So the United States, Europe, it's very deep disclosure rates. But actually in the last, I would say 5 to 7 years, things have changed quite fundamentally. And I'm quite excited to see the changes because, our biggest growing areas of disclosure are certainly in places like China. I mean, Japan has always been our sort of 3rd biggest disclosure area anyway, but Asia is really moving fast. India, all the different countries across Southeast Asia really coming into our system really high, with really high numbers now. And one of the things we've noticed there, the first thing is we started to engage with big buyers. We recognize that companies respond to their clients almost more than they respond to what their investors say, right? And for obvious reasons. And actually in other parts of the world, the listed companies don't make up the majority of the companies that make up the economy. And that's a broad sweeping statement, but really true for many parts of Asia in particular, and some parts of Latin America. And as a result, we created a procurement program. It's really driven by far. It's the biggest driver right now of disclosure within our system. And that has meant big increases in China. And because we engage very deeply with stakeholders across the Chinese government, we've also been able to bring on board into the system some of the state-owned enterprises. That's really exciting. In India, of course, many family-owned businesses. It's caused us to change our tactics in how we talk about it, how we sort of create the business case for coming into the system, for taking action. And it's been we've had to learn some hard lessons because our approach has been sort of one-dimensional, and then it became multifaceted. And our local offices will encourage us to, no, that's not how you emphasize narrative here. That is not the narrative we need to use. We need to use this narrative here. And in each country, we've learned there are different drivers, different political constructs, and so adapting and ensuring that you're able to speak to that, and understanding that the way in which we've seen what's right and what's wrong is not necessarily universally true. And that has been very exciting. And I really want, the private companies are coming into our system. Many of them recognize the value of this journey. But I agree with you, we need to do more in that space, because it's particularly in the sector that we're talking about today, it is fundamental.
Yeah, in fact, you are marvelously describing my journey as well, which is to be able to drive through different realities and different way of speaking, different dictionaries, different narratives, while trying to achieve the same goal. And it's not a straight journey.
No, it definitely isn't. It definitely isn't. And I mean, I can imagine, if you're speaking, I mean, I'd love to know, some of the companies you mentioned as members are clearly very big national oil companies, right? So that means they are state-owned, and I come from South Africa originally. We have, for example, a very big state-owned utility. That is our utility. And so it means when you're talking about what the utilities need to do, you're engaging with the utility itself, but you're also engaging with government, because those two things are intrinsically linked. Do you find that that's absolutely critical for your initiative as well? Are you needing to engage with policymakers in those countries where you have national oil companies, and is that kind of coming into the initiative, or do you find that it is sufficient to work with the stakeholders of the company itself?
The experience is that we need to work with the companies, understanding that they will have to work and deal and sometimes get the green line of their government. And therefore, we need to have to find the right angles and the right ways to help them, to bring them the support to work with their governments. And I think this is very important. And I could, give you a straight example, which is an almost obvious one. The bulk of the OGCI companies engaged in the very famous Vatican Statement, which was issued a year ago. Obviously, for reasons that we can all understand, not all our members could. But what is inside is to some extent relevant for all of them.
Yeah.
And therefore, we tried to work with the member companies who were not in that ship to try to see what could be relevant to them and what were the matters on which they could convince their government to support them. And we issued our own statement, which is coherent with the Vatican State, but embarking this hidden part of the iceberg, which is absolutely key to the world of climate.
It's interesting. It's almost as if describing a parallel, an international sort of multilateral diplomatic body, really, in many ways, because I'm sure that some of those discussions sort of transverse boundaries that are out of the energy transition per se, and actually really quite cultural in nature, and that's so quite profound, and I think is one of the big values of the very international membership that you have.